Or do you believe that Jesus was God? Yes, but I think I am too, and so are you. Like, again, I can affirm certain things, the same things that I affirmed before about Jesus. Like you said, it's an expanded view of those concepts now.
Hello, my guest today is returning guest for the third time, and I think that's a first. I'm here today with Keith Giles. So in our first interview, we talked about his deconstruction journey. In our second interview, we talked about his book, Sola Mysterium, when he began moving outside of the progressive Christian circles. And we're back again today to talk about his recent book, Sola Deus, which, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that's translated only God.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. I think that title is brilliant, and we'll get into that though. But first, for those who aren't familiar with Keith, he is the author of the 7-part best-selling Jesus On series. He's appeared on CNN, USA Today, BuzzFeed, and Tell Me Everything. He is the co-owner of Choir Publishings and blogs regularly on Pathos, and he also hosts several podcasts. The Second Cup with Keith. He co-hosts Apostates Anonymous and the Heretic Happy Hour, and you can find him at keithgiles.com. Thank you so much for joining me, Keith.
Oh, Melissa, thank you so much. It's an honor to be back again for the third time, so thank you for having me back.
Yes, I always love our conversations. So I'm excited to get into this because, of course, every person's journey is unique, but we've had similar experiences of moving out of Christianity into progressive Christianity, and then from progressive Christianity out into a more expanded way of viewing spirituality. And it is quite a journey. So let's start. For those people who may not be really familiar, just briefly share with us where you started as a Christian pastor and how you ended up where you are now.
Yeah, I'll try to give a short version of this. It's always hard, but I'll do my best. So yeah, I was raised in a conservative evangelical Christian home, grew up in El Paso, Texas. And so I was like full on, listened to Rush Limbaugh, member of the NRA, the whole thing. And I voted straight ticket Republican my whole life. I had a pretty significant event, or sort of two things that happened to me. And when we were living in California after I got married, that helped me sort of take a step away from organized Christianity. I was a pastor, licensed and ordained pastor, and my wife and I were doing a church. We had planted a church in California. And so at that point, we felt to step away and to start something really different. So we started meeting in homes and giving the offering to the poor. And we kind of stepped out from under the umbrella of sort of any covering or denomination or anything like that. So that gave us some freedom to really ask any questions we wanted to ask, read anything we wanted to read, think anything we wanted to think. And so that's what probably began my, what we call a deconstruction journey. And then started writing these books, the Jesus On series. I've been doing that over the past 5 years or so. And then, after I went through that process and writing those books to try to help other people who were struggling with the same things I was struggling with, after I finished that 7-part series, it was very much, well, now what? You know what I mean? I've answered all these major questions of what I call like sort of the pillars of deconstruction. I know what I think now about, or what I don't believe about all these other things. Great. But now what? And that was Sola Mysterium. The last time I was here, I talked about that. And that was just realization of embracing mystery and that we can't talk about God without admitting that no one knows anything. We have no certainty about this. And so, that's kind of where I'm at. And it's very much like you said, initially it was a journey outside of evangelical Christianity into something what people would call more like progressive Christianity. Felt very comfortable there for quite a while. But now I am moving sort of outside of that as well and realizing that I'm leaving behind some of those things. And I like the way you use that word, expansive. I think that's right. I think it is. I'm expanding my views and my definitions of some of these things, especially when it comes to God or religious or spiritual experience, things like that. And it is much for the better. I agree. I think there's much more freedom, less worry and anxiety about getting hung up on beliefs and doctrines and who's right and wrong and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But I will say, if I can, writing Sola Deus was probably definitely the most difficult thing I've done to this point. I nearly gave up at least twice in writing the book and wrote it, rewrote it, wrote it again. It was really, really difficult and painful process, but I'm glad I went through it. It was worth it. It was not an easy thing.
Was that because of the personal journey you were going through, sorting through your own beliefs, or was it more because of the reception that you were receiving from people?
Well, a little both. Yeah, I'll just say quickly about the reception well, Sola Mysterium was the first time I recognized, because of the reactions of some of my progressive Christian friends to Sola Mysterium, that I was leaving progressive Christianity. Because people that had previously endorsed my books in the past enthusiastically, when I sent them Sola Mysterium, they were like, yeah, no, can't do this. Can't go with you here. And that was a shock. And that was painful. So to write Sola Deus, I knew, well, I'm going even farther outside the lines of what I talked about in Sola Mysterium, right? I understand it. I can understand it. I mean, I think the specific authors and people that weren't willing to endorse me beyond Sola Mysterium, what I realized is all of them are pastors. You know what I mean? They're kind of pastoring a progressive community or church of some kind. And I can understand that for them to endorse me when I'm saying in my books that Jesus is great, but so is Black Elk and Rumi and Socrates and many other voices out there, that they weren't comfortable with that. They weren't comfortable like letting the people that they feel like they're shepherding or trying to lead spiritually, they weren't comfortable with that message kind of being endorsed. Or the idea that the Bible isn't maybe the best possible spiritual guide or source of truth for us to follow. So that's another big thing. And so, I mean, I can understand it. I used to be where they are, and I can understand them being nervous about that. But that definitely did happen. I had one person, I won't name him, but I sent him the book and he came back and said he couldn't endorse it. And he said, you sound like Richard Rohr. And I said, thank you. And he goes, no, I hate Richard Rohr. I'm like, oh, well, there's our problem right there. So yeah, it was hard for that reason, because I knew that I was going to put something in print of what I thought and what I believed that was moving even farther away from those things. And so I knew, well, I'm going to get more pushback. I'm going to get more of a negative reaction. And that is scary. But I think it was mostly difficult for the personal side, like you're saying.
Right.
Because I was wrestling with things myself that I'll be honest, probably the reason it was the hardest one to write so far is it's the first book I've ever written where I started writing the book not knowing my way out. I didn't know where I was going, right? All my other books, I've always outlined the book first, all the way through chapter 1 to the final chapter. I know every chapter. I know what I'm going to talk about, what I'm going to say. I know how they connect together, how I get it's like a little path, right? How do I get from chapter 1 to the final chapter? And normally, all the other books I've written, I've known that before I sit down. And with Sola Deus, I kind of knew about halfway into it. I knew how to get about halfway through it. But I knew there were questions I was going to wrestle with and struggle with to try to make sense of that. When I started writing, I hadn't made sense of them. I didn't know where I was going to land. And so that made it really, really challenging, really difficult. And it wasn't until the final, like the third time through the book, that a couple of things finally clicked for me. It was like, oh, that's it. Oh, okay. I did figure it out, thankfully. And then I was able to find my way out of the forest that I had walked myself into. So I think for those reasons, it was difficult. And probably just the simplest reason why it was difficult is that, again, I'm trying to write a book about God, but I'm recognizing how difficult it is to even talk about God. Like human language it's not capable. It's not designed to even have a conversation to describe what you're really talking about when you're talking about God. That's a struggle as well. Like, how do I even find the words to begin the conversation with somebody? For all those reasons, writing this book was very, very challenging, and I'm glad I got through it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. If you don't mind, I'd really like to dive in there a little bit, because this is something that, being in the deconstruction space, so many people go through this and don't have anybody to talk to about it.
Yeah.
And it's the experience of going through losing the support of friends, colleagues, family members in some cases, And I had much the same experience when I came out of progressive Christian circles and started quoting other sources like Hinduism or Buddhism or A Course in Miracles. And it was like I had gone through this first deconstruction when I left mainstream Christianity, and then you go through this second deconstruction almost where it's like the second falling away of people that did support you through that first deconstruction. And it can be so devastating. I mean, I know I almost lost friends over it.
Yeah.
I had people tell me, well, you're not my true sister in Christ anymore, so I'm never going to speak to you again. I can't have your influence in my life, and things like that. And then there's also the ongoing fear with people that do stick with you that are Christian, that at some point you're going to say something that's just too far over the line and you're going to lose them too. So I think it's important to talk about so that people know that this is a normal thing and they're not alone in it.
Oh, Melissa, I tell you what, I should have talked to you a long time ago, because everything you just said is exactly what I have been going through as I've gone through this process of thinking through things and writing this book. It's exactly what you said, that whole second deconstruction. It is exactly right. I just remember, because so my first deconstruction, when I was going through it, it was difficult. Of course, it's painful. It's not easy. But I've been through it now, right? So that's kind of in my past. And so I've written a series of books on it. I do the Square One group where I help people walk through deconstruction, help them figure out their own trajectory forward into their, whatever their reconstruction process looks like. And I've been doing that for 4 years, right? So I feel like I have a really good grip on this whole initial deconstruction thing, right? But then now, it's exactly what you said. I remember just saying to myself, I feel like I'm going through another deconstruction. But the scary thing is, I don't know what this one's like. There's no one, at least when I went through my first deconstruction, there were people ahead of me. I could read Peter Enns or Rachel Held Evans or Brad Jersak or something like that and be like, oh, okay, good. They're a few steps ahead of me, but they're telling me it's okay and they're okay. It seems like they landed in a good spot, so I guess I'll be all right. But this sort of second deconstruction I feel like I'm going through, other than you, I don't know anybody exactly who is going through something like that, right? I don't know, where are those books? I don't know. I mean, maybe they're out there. Maybe you can help me. I hope my book is a book like that for some people who do find themselves going through their second deconstruction. But it seems like there's a whole bunch of people going through that first deconstruction, right? That's the big movement everybody's talking about. It feels like whatever this second deconstruction phase is, it hasn't picked up any momentum yet, at the same level of momentum that the initial deconstruction does.
Yeah, I agree. And that was one of the issues when I went through it, is there was no one talking about it. I found there was one person online that I was following that went from mainstream Christianity to progressive Christianity to New Age, or for lack of a better word, but there's nothing there. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so exciting to me that you're writing these books, because you're documenting your story from the beginning to the end. And that's one thing I was going to ask you about, because you mentioned in your book how your views on things have changed over time. And I really admire how you've been honest to put yourself out there and go back and self-correct, but yet not be ashamed of the fact that I used to have this belief. For instance, you may have had a different belief on the atonement or why Jesus died on the cross that you represented in those earlier books. That's just something that I really appreciate about your writing.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And then, going back to my original deconstruction process, there was a moment I was reading Marcus Borg, who I love. And he has a book, I think it's called Meeting Jesus Again for the Very First Time or something. I think that's the title of it. Something similar to that. And anyway, I was reading his book. I was really enjoying it, but I came to a spot in the book that scared the crap out of me. Really. It was just like, it was too much too soon. I wasn't ready for it. And I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my faith. I'm going to be left with nothing. Right. And thank goodness my wife helped me process through, and I was like, okay, tuck me off the ledge. I'm okay. I just kind of put the book aside and I just moved on. And what's really funny is I talk about in Solideus that I find myself coming back around to the exact thing that scared the crap out of me probably like 5 or 6 years ago with Marcus Borg. And now I'm picking it up again and I'm looking at it again and I'm going, oh yeah, that makes sense. Right. So as I'm now trying to write about sort of the same kind of thing, I'm remembering how I felt when I wasn't ready for it. You know what I mean? And so in Sola Deus, I'm going out of my way to like be very, very careful with my readers. Like, hey, if this is too much too soon, feel free to skip to the next chapter, right?
Right.
Because I just know it was such a scary, painful thing for me
Right.
to kind of be exposed to some ideas that were just terrifying to me. I mean, at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're not at all. Now I'm like, yes, this is awesome. And I totally believe it. So yeah, I'm trying to be really careful and gentle with readers if they're not ready. I've even told people, some people are like, well, I've only read one or two of your Jesus On series, but I can't wait to read Sola Deus. And I'm kind of like, maybe you should wait. Go ahead, but just finish the Jesus On first, then read Sola Mysterium. And then if you feel like it, then read Sola Deus. Because I just don't know. Not everybody's in a place where they're ready to wrestle with some of these things. And so, yeah, that's why I'm really careful in that. And in telling my own story with people too, you know, I think that helps people too to process it. It's not just theological gymnastics, just trying to work out little things in my mind. It is also figuring out where these things fit in my experience and what does this really make sense for where I'm at right now. And so, yeah, hopefully that transparency and vulnerability it helps people too. I hope that also kind of makes it a little safer for them if they're processing these things.
Right. Absolutely. So you mentioned that there were some questions you were wrestling with when you began writing Sola Deus, and you didn't know what the answers were going to be. So without giving away spoilers for the book, are you able to share what some of those questions might have been?
Yeah, I think I can talk about a couple of them. Well, I think probably the first question that I was wrestling with at the time that I wasn't sure the answer to. So when I started writing the book, and then especially coming out of the 7-part Jesus On series that I wrote, I was pretty firmly in the camp of like Richard Rohr, the panentheism kind of view, right? God is in all things, but God is not all things. And I was pretty comfortable with that view. And I would have told people, yeah, I'm a panentheist. So I was like Richard Rohr in that sense. But as I continued to process things, I started in my mind trying to figure out, this is probably my first mistake, but trying to figure out like, okay, here's panentheism. I think this makes sense to me. But then there's this other view, right, which is pantheism, which is the view that God is all things. And then I started trying to like kind of hold them both in my mind and say, well, what's the difference between like, where does panentheism end and pantheism begin? It's like, well, how do you distinguish God as a being who is in all things but isn't all things? And in what ways is that possible? So initially it was like a philosophical question. I just couldn't make sense of it. And so when I wrote Sola Deus, I was leaning towards, to be honest, as I started writing the book, I was beginning to let go of panentheism and just full on say, no, maybe it's pantheism. Maybe God is all things. And so as I started writing the book, that's where I was headed. In the first draft of the book, that's where I was headed. But in the process of writing the book and then sitting down to think through those questions, I came up with some other questions that made me doubt that too. Maybe like, well, that doesn't make sense. So for example, in my experience with God, whatever God is, whatever my experience of God is, and trying to explain God, you can't do that. But I have had experiences of God since I was a little kid, even before I was officially a Christian, right? And I've had some pretty significant spiritual experiences in my life. So the question, the challenge to me, to myself was, if God is not a personal God, a personal being, but that sort of implies separation, right? For me to be me and for God to be this other being that I can relate to, then God has to be a separate being from myself. Which means then it can't be pantheism, because pantheism says there is no separate being. God is all things. But this experience of relationship with God, that God, whatever God is this relational being. God desires connection and relationship. There is a dialogue. There is a give and take. There is a knowing going on there, between a relationship going on there. So then that kind of stopped me and made me rethink that too. Like, well, what's going on with this relationship thing? How can there be a relationship if God is me and God is everything? And so that was sort of the big question that I wrestled with in the middle of sort of that forest I walked myself into. And as I'm writing the book, it was like, okay, how do I make sense of this? And I think the journey itself is important. So it's not so much like, oh, Keith, tell us the answer. Because like that's not the point. The point really is for me, having that dialogue, wrestling those things out, trying to figure these things out in my mind, in my heart. What is the answer to these things? So I'm kind of not going to give you the answer that I came up with because it's in the book. But I will say this, that I don't think it's either one. I don't think it's panentheism. I don't think it's pantheism, but there's something else. And I wouldn't have gotten there if I hadn't done the process of thinking it through. There's also something in the book that I do. It's kind of funny, but it's real. It's totally real. Like I really did this. I don't know where it is, but I have the napkin somewhere. I literally sat down and started drawing on a napkin to try to just understand some of these concepts of my relationship between God and all things. And so in the book, there's little diagrams of those drawings that I made. And so, I went through these different stages. There's probably like 6 different drawings that I made. So I made a first initial drawing and it made sense to a point, but I'm like, well, I looked at it. Well, no, that's not right. Because I have a box around God. So I took the box away from God. And then like there's God and then there's Christ and there's me. Yeah, but then there's a box around Christ and there's not a separation between God and Christ. So I took that box away. And then there's me. I'm like, well, no, that doesn't make sense either because I'm connected to Christ and I'm one with Christ and all things. So I took that box away. And then it was like, well, but then they're still sort of separated by space. So like you just kind of take the letters and mush them all into one big thing, right? And so anyway, I had to go through these stages of drawing this and redrawing these concepts on a napkin. And every one of those stages was important. There's no way I could have just sat down and jumped straight to the very last thing that I ended up writing on the napkin. I needed those stages in between. Like each stage helped me think about one aspect, then allowed me to rethink another aspect. And then when I thought about that, then that led me to the next thing. And that's kind of the process I think that's going on in the book that I think is helpful if people are willing and ready to ask those kinds of questions. Then I think the book will be very helpful in walking into that process.
Another sort of paradox that you brought up in the book with regards to God and how we've been taught to view God, it has to do with the problem of suffering and evil. And this caught my attention because this is still the number one question that I get in my comments section.
Yeah.
Even though I'm interviewing near-death experiencers who are talking about planning our lives ahead of time and this and that, it's like there's still not a satisfactory answer to this problem of suffering and how that could be allowed in a good universe. And you brought up a point that because of the problem of suffering, people are starting to move away from the idea of an all-powerful personal God.
Mm-hmm.
And that got me thinking because I had never really thought about it like that before. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, well, that is true. This whole question of suffering is the biggest question, right? Even some of the greatest theologians and apologists out there will admit suffering is the one that they don't like to talk about because there just aren't any good answers. The best answer that I think I've come across, and I want to say with a caveat, I don't think it's a perfect answer. I don't think it's the silver bullet, but it's a better answer than I've heard so far. And that's my friend Thomas J. Ord has a book called God Can't, and several of his books dealing with this question, right? If God is good, then why is there suffering, right? Why does God allow suffering to happen? And I like where he's going with it, and I agree with his premise. And he begins with the assumption that God is love. And if God is love by definition isn't manipulative. It's not coercive, right? If you truly love someone, you don't try to manipulate them or coerce them against their will. And God being pure love, therefore love isn't coercive, God isn't coercive. So therefore God is not in control. God is not allowing anything. Because when you use that language of God is allowing, what you're implying is that God could stop it, but decided not to. And what Tom is saying is that, well, no, because it would go against love's nature to interfere, to manipulate, to coerce. But at the same time, because God is love, God does desire good out of every situation. And so, again, this relationship, God does desire to collaborate with us, or we collaborate with the divine to bring good out of situations of suffering and injustice and evil and things like that. So it's very much dependent on this aspect of connection and collaboration, right? So I think the question of suffering on that side of things, like, so why does suffering happen? Again, I don't think it's perfect. I think there are some holes in it, but I think there's less holes in that than in the idea that God has some magical plan, mysterious plan, and you just don't know what it is. And that's why your kid had to get cancer. And that's why your mom had to die. Like, I reject that. I think those are bad. Those are just not right. So I like that idea. It helps me process this sort of like, why is suffering happening in the universe and in the world we live in a little better. I like that. But then there's a more granular question too, because my assertion is that Christ is in everyone and everyone is in Christ, right? Or whatever you call that. Like I call it Christ because I come out of a Christian tradition. You might call it source or the universe. I don't know, whatever, love, whatever you want to call it. But then people will ask the question like, well, okay, wait a minute. If Christ isn't everybody, what about murderers and child rapists and terrorists and these kind of things? Like, how can you say that Christ is in everyone or God is in everyone when there is so much evil in the world? And it's a great question. That's a very valid question. For me, the answer that I have right now, the thing that makes sense to me is that yes, Christ is in everyone, but Christ is not sort of awake in everyone. There's a woman that has a testimony of, she has this epiphany. She's riding in the subway and she can suddenly just see Christ in everyone around her. Everyone she looks at, she sees Christ in it. And it goes on for like a couple of days. But she has this little phrase. She says that she saw Christ in everyone, but in some people, Christ was dead in his tomb awaiting resurrection. And I think that is a beautiful metaphor. I think that's exactly right. So I think when we see people who are doing harm to other people or to themselves, when we see people, what's happening is there is Christ in them, but the Christ that's in them is not awake, is not alive yet. They're not alive to the Christ that's in them yet. And that's why that's happening. It doesn't mean Christ isn't in them. It just means that Christ isn't awake in them and alive in them and moving in them. And that person isn't connected to that part of Christ that's in them. So at least that's what makes sense to me.
I love that explanation. And since we're speaking of Christ, I have to ask you now, what is your view of Jesus and why he came? Do you still believe that he died on the cross? And if so, what was the point of that?
Oh, yeah. See, this is where we start getting into trouble, right? But I'm totally happy to answer these questions and to talk about it because I was saying before I hit record, I can't talk about this book without explaining where I'm at now.
Right.
So what do I think about Jesus? Well, it's so hard to answer. Again, it's hard to answer this question. Like if someone said, well, do you believe that Jesus was the Christ? Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course. But then but the next thing I would say is the same way that you are. Like the same Christ that was in Jesus of Nazareth, this guy that lived 2,000 years ago in Palestine, that same Christ that was in him is in you and me and everyone. Do you believe that Jesus was God? Yes. I think I am too, and so are you. Like, again, so it's not, I can affirm certain things, the same things that I affirmed before about Jesus. I just, like you said, it's an expanded view of those concepts now, where it's expanded outward from Jesus. It's not just Jesus. And now I would say that I would admit, I feel like that Jesus is probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest example that we have of someone exhibiting the Christ consciousness, exhibiting living out of this Christ reality. But he's not the only one, right? I would say, yeah, Buddha had a Christ awareness like 400 years before Jesus. And Mr. Rogers and Gandhi and Mother Teresa and many, many other people. So yeah. So I guess I look at Jesus now as someone who was enlightened, someone who did see the Christ, who did know the truth, who I think if you read the red letters, he got it. He was trying to help us get it. I think one of the most powerful things Jesus says in the Gospels, and I talk about this in the book, is Jesus has this very powerful revelation. And he tells his disciples that one day they're going to get it too. And he knows they don't get it now. But he says, one day you will realize. That's the way he phrases it. He says, one day you will realize. Meaning you don't get it now, but one day you will. And here it is. I am in the Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. And the problem, I think, with Christianity is we make that only about Jesus. It's only about Jesus. But I would say, like, well, what if I had that same epiphany? What if I said, Melissa, one day you're going to realize that I'm in the Father, but you are in me, and I'm in you. And I could say that to anybody I spoke to.
Right.
And then eventually they would have the revelation, the realization, oh my gosh, I'm in the Father, I'm in God, and I'm in you, and you're in me, right? It's this statement of connection. It's this realization, this recognition. To me, this is the awakening. This is the epiphany. This is the big aha, right? This is what I'm talking about in Solideus. This recognition that there is no separation between whatever we call God and us. And so it's not just that I personally have this oneness that I can experience with God. If we all have that same oneness, then I have the same oneness with you. How could I not? If we're all incredibly one with God and with Christ, so are you. And we're all mingled in together. So I guess that's how I look at Jesus now, as someone who had a Christ consciousness, maybe the best ever, did his best to communicate it in the terminology that he had to the people, the very primitive ways of thinking that people had around him at the time. And the great thing is that awareness carried forward, right? So like when Paul comes along, he also is speaking this way, right? He says to the church that you are filled with the fullness of Christ, who fills everything in every way. Okay, what? Right? So I'm filled with the fullness of the one who fills everything in every way. Again, that's talking about this incredible oneness and connection with this cosmic concept of Christ. And you see this in Ephesians and in Colossians, which many people think, by the way, Paul didn't write those. But they were written by, like most scholars who would agree that Paul did not actually write Ephesians and Colossians. They do agree that it was most likely written by one of his disciples.
Okay.
And this was a common thing, by the way. We look at it today, oh, that's plagiarism. That's not right. You wrote a book and you pretended to be someone you weren't, right? But back in the day, that was a normal thing. That was actually seen as you were honoring that person. It's exactly what we see with like Plato and Socrates, right? We only even have the writings of Socrates because Plato tells us all these things that Socrates said. If you get a copy of the writings of Socrates, it's actually not written by Socrates. It's one of his disciples writing it down for us because Socrates didn't write it down. And so Jesus didn't write anything down either. His disciples wrote it down and gave us the teachings. And the same kind of thing is happening with Paul, that after he died, there were teachings that he gave his disciples that he didn't write down. And if I would like say I was one of his disciples and he taught me these sort of concepts that we're talking about of my oneness with God, my oneness with everyone and all things, that's a pretty significant teaching. And he never put that down in paper. And so he's dead now, but I know I learned these things and I learned them from him, from my teacher. I'm not going to write them down like the book of Keith because they're not my ideas. I didn't come up with it. He did, right? So I want to honor him. So I write it as if it's him because I want everyone to know this isn't me. This came from him. He said these things. And so they'll put the teacher's name on it. And that's kind of what we think happened with Ephesians and Colossians. These were, I hate to talk like this, but this is the fact. Jesus had secret teachings.
Yeah.
In all the Gospels, he says this. He even talks about this. I speak to parables when I talk to the people, but when I talk to you, I speak plainly, right? We over and over again, Jesus affirms this, right? And so, again, this was just a common practice between a rabbi and his students, his disciples. And we think Paul did the same thing. Paul also had a circle of people that he was discipling, and he says the same thing. He also talks about, right, these other secret things that he can't reveal as he's writing the letters to the church in Corinth or all these kind of things. He's like, I wish I could. I wish you were ready, but you're not ready, which means there are things he hasn't told them, but he wants to, but he's waiting for them to reach a point that they're ready for these things, right? I guess their second deconstruction process. And as long as we're getting woo-woo, I'll just go ahead and I'll jump all the way in.
Yeah, go for it.
Because I've also in this process become really, really fascinated by the Gospel of Thomas. And actually, I have a course, an online course where I walk people through the Gospel of Thomas.
I've seen that.
And I'm publishing part 1 of a commentary on the Gospel of Thomas. Hopefully it'll be out before the end of the year. But eventually it'll be a 2-part. I'm going to cover the whole thing. And yeah, I'm just fascinated with Thomas. And the reason why I'm fascinated with Thomas is the Gospel of Thomas is a collection of the sayings of Jesus. A lot of people who don't know about the Gospel of Thomas will say, oh, that's a Gnostic text. It's really not a Gnostic text because Gnostic texts have very specific teachings about the nature of God and the world and who created the world and very weird ideas. Gnosticism itself is actually kind of strange. But Thomas has none of that. And in fact, Thomas is probably not even, you shouldn't even really call it a gospel, because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those gospels have a birth narrative. They tell us about Jesus' parents and how he was born, how he grew up, what was his occupation. We have his ministry. We have his baptism. We have his teaching. We have his run-ins with the Pharisees. We have his rest, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and his ascension. And it talks about his coming again, right? So all of that is typically what you talk about in the gospel. Thomas doesn't mention any of that. None of that. It literally is as if one of Jesus' disciples was sitting there as he was speaking and just writing down, and Jesus said, and Jesus said, and Jesus said. So it is an example of what scholars call a Q document, right? To get really super technical, I guess, Bible scholars have tried to figure out why there is so much correlation between Matthew and Luke. In other words, when they quote Jesus, they quote verbatim. So where are they getting it from, right? And some of it is even also in Mark, but not all of it. But there's overlap between these three gospels. So the theory was that there had to have been, at the time that they wrote those gospels, another document, a source of the sayings of Jesus. Right. And that they were all borrowing, copying. So they're telling their story. Jesus went here, he did that, blah, blah, blah. And then he said, and then they'll flip over to the sayings document and find a saying and stick it in there, right?
Right.
That's probably exactly what they did. So up until the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas in 1954, I think, something like that, fairly recently, the idea of a Q document was a myth. It was a theory. But then we found Thomas and it was like, oh, well, this is a Q document. It may not be the Q document, but it is an example of a type of document that is just a collection of the sayings of Jesus. And the other reason why it's super significant is half of those sayings in Thomas show up in the other gospels that we have.
Right.
So they match. They're correct. But the other half of the sayings are not. So we have probably 50 something sayings of Jesus that are unique to Thomas. And all of this to say, the reason why I'm excited about Thomas is this single message of Thomas. This is the key to understanding Thomas. Everything Jesus is saying in those sayings of Jesus from Thomas, they're all about our oneness with God and with one another. That's what they're all about. Every one of them, you can read them through that lens and they make perfect sense. And I would say if you don't read them through that lens, Thomas makes no sense at all. It's the first time I read it, I was like, this is gobbledygook. It just is nonsense. It's just the silliest thing I've ever read. Jesus didn't talk this way. But again, if you understand that, oh no, what he's telling his disciples is the stuff he didn't talk about when he was talking to the crowds. This is him and his disciples sitting around the campfire and him just saying these things, and they're writing these things down. That's what we have in Thomas. And so it's very exciting to me to see this and to realize this. And again, since if it wasn't for the discovery of Thomas in 1954, we wouldn't have had sort of the evidence that Jesus really did think these things. And he really did teach these ideas to his disciples.
I'm so glad you brought up that, because I love the Gospel of Thomas also. And I remember that it used to be pretty dismissed and disregarded. That's, like you said, it's Gnostic. And it seems like anything that's at all mystical gets labeled as Gnostic without really looking into it to see if that's actually the case.
Real quick, one more thing about Thomas, and then I'll stop because I could go on. But the other thing about Thomas that's really fascinating to me is dating the book of Thomas. So the copy that we have, that we uncovered at Nagamati, right, in 1954, we can date it to around the 3rd century, right? I think 3rd, maybe 4th century. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty late. But we found fragments, I think in the 1800s, that we didn't know was Thomas at the time, but now we can see, this was from Thomas, and that's much older. And so, and also by the way, some of early church fathers like Irenaeus and others talked about Thomas, we know that there was a Gospel of Thomas. And actually what we can do now is and most scholars I think agree with this, the Gospel of Mark was written first, then came Matthew and Luke, roughly the same time. And then much later was the Gospel of John, right?
Right.
There's about 10 years apart between each of these. So there's a 40-year span of time between Mark and John. And we can date the Gospel of Thomas, that the original collection of the sayings of Thomas was somewhere between Mark and John. So it's not a recent thing. It's not a made up thing that came later. Another reason to think that it's not a made up thing is because it doesn't make any sense. If these other Gospels had already been written, and then your goal is like, I want to subvert those Gospels, I want to come up with a different story. And by the way, people did, like the Gospel of Philip and some other Gospel of Judas, right? Much later, they came up with another story. But those are stories, and we know that they came later. But you can tell that their goal was to subvert some of the ideas in the other Gospels because they tell these stories. Thomas isn't telling any stories. So it doesn't make sense. Like if your goal, if the guy, whoever wrote Thomas did it later, and they did it later with the goal of undermining some ideas in the other Gospels, that's not the way to do it. You don't just have a bunch of sayings that you don't explain, right? It's just a bunch of sayings. It gives more credence to the fact that there is no other agenda here. It literally is just Jesus said and some sayings that are not explained. So you kind of need to understand it, have the key to it at the beginning. You need to start with the assumption that Jesus is talking to his disciples about our oneness with God and our oneness with one another in all things. And if you do read it from that perspective, then it makes perfect sense.
Since we're on the topic, are there any other Gospels or writings that have been discovered that have been dated early enough to be legitimate, or is it just the Gospel of Thomas?
Well, I think nothing compares to Thomas. I don't think there's anything equal to Thomas that we've found yet. It would be wonderful if we could find a complete manuscript of the Gospel of Mary, because what we have is great, but it's a fragment. And right when it gets the best part is what's missing.
Oh, no.
It's like Mary is saying, the disciples ask Mary, tell us what Jesus spoke to you. And he goes, and so Mary sat down and said to them,
oh,
and
no.
There's like 3 pages missing. So it's horrible. If we could ever find a full Gospel of Mary, that would be great. There's another one that's not necessarily dated. It's not dated to that same early time period, but it is a great window into what some Christians, and by the way, these were Christians. They get called Gnostics, but they didn't call themselves Gnostics. They called themselves Christians,
right? Who
followed these teachings. There's a guy named Valentinus, and he's fantastic. If I'd have lived back then, I would have been following this Valentinus guy. And so Valentinus and his followers, his sort of brand of Christianity that was going on, this was after Paul died, was all about this, right? He was all about this oneness with God, oneness, the separation is an illusion and all this kind of stuff. And everybody thinks, they're pretty sure that he's the one who authored another book that we found at Nag Hammadi called The Gospel of Truth.
Okay.
And I really like it. Now that is a little bit more of a story. It does tell some stories and some of it is really weird. But what I love about the Gospel of Thomas is the way it talks about God. Because it talks about God from this place of awe and wonder and mystery. That's really beautiful. And here's the great thing about Valentinus, or Valentinius, I never know how to pronounce his name. But the great thing about him is that we only know this because of the people that didn't like him. So I think it's Irenaeus or maybe Tertullian. Anyway, some of the early church fathers who were contemporary with him, who didn't like him, who were against, right? They would write, don't follow this guy, Valentine. Well, as they're telling you why they don't like him, we know from what they tell us that Valentinus had his sort of mentor, his disciple was a guy named Theodotus. And Theodotus, according to Valentinus's, enemies, Theodotus was a disciple of Paul.
Oh, okay. Yes. I remember hearing.
Yeah. So this is another reason why all of this we're talking about. So Jesus taught the secret teaching to his disciples. What was it? This oneness with God and oneness with all things. Paul teaches the same thing in Ephesians and Colossians. Well, we know he didn't write that. We know one of his disciples did. And we know that Theodotus taught Valentinus, and Valentinus taught the same exact thing. So you can trace this teaching from Jesus through Paul, through Theodotus, and through Valentinus, through the Gospels, through Thomas, through Ephesians and Colossians, and through the Gospel of Truth and some other writings of Valentinus, that this kind of was the thread that we can trace back to Jesus, this teaching of the illusion of separation. And again, so all of that stuff is super fascinating to me, right? It really makes me think like, well, okay, maybe I'm onto something, or maybe I'm on the right track. Because it seems like this is a pretty ancient one. And I think you can trace it back to Jesus.
Well, Keith, I could talk to you for another hour or two. There's so many directions we could take this. conversation and keep right on going. But I want to close out by quoting my favorite part of your book. I have it up here. So when you're talking about I am in God and God is in you and you are in me, this teaching that Jesus taught, as I'm listening to you talk about it, it just takes me back to some of my own experiences. Because being raised in the church, I was taught like you have to seek God and find God and try to please God and all these things as if God is separate from you.
Yeah.
But when I had this realization that thing, and I took that very seriously. I mean, my whole point to my life was finding God and having this experience with God. And when I realized God is right here, what I'm looking for is right here. It's within me. It's within you. It's within everything. Yeah. There's nothing that compares to that. And there's a passage in your book that just describes it so beautifully in chapter 3. Do you mind if I quote a small section?
Oh, please. No, please. I can't wait. I don't know what you're going to read, so I'm excited.
Okay. So you're talking about a hypothetical scenario, which actually is a very real scenario. If there's a child born in a remote part of the world that doesn't have access to hearing the gospel or getting a message from a missionary, and then you said, now let me ask you something. Can this little girl know God? Can she hear God's voice? Can she experience a profound connection with the divine? And if you say no, then why not? Does she need someone to come and teach her religious doctrine first? Does she require a temple to channel God's presence? And then you go on to say, why? Because God has never required any of those things to make God's self known. All of creation pulsates with the presence of the divine. Every bird song, every ripe fruit, every drop of rain, every night sky flung wide with stars is God's voice surrounding, penetrating, permeating every pore of our being. And I think that so beautifully sums up the experience of so many of us and the message that we're trying to promote. So, Keith, with that, I want to thank you for writing this book and being willing to put yourself out there as you go on this journey. And I'd like to give you a chance to share with the viewers where they can find your book and anything else you have going on that you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, Melissa, thank you so much. It's always wonderful to hear other people read. I'm like, did I say that? That was not bad. That was pretty good. Sales is available now. It's the Audible book is coming soon, I hope in about a month or so. But right now you can get the paperback and the Kindle version on Amazon. And yeah, you can, like you said at the beginning, I blog. I'm on Patheos. You can find me at keithgiles.com. Check out my other podcasts that I do. And yeah, what else? I mean, I'm doing Matthew DeStefano, who's also a choir author, and myself in January became the co-owners of Choir Publishing. And so in addition to writing books, I'm also kind of like trying to help other people get their books and their stories out there. And that's been a lot of fun. So check out choir.com. If you're an author, by the way, and you have a great book and a great story, we're interested in hearing what you've got and talking to you about that. So you can just go to choir.com. It's QUOIR. It's a very weird spelling, QUOIR.com. And there's a place there for you to sort of send us something and let us know about your book. Yeah. So I guess that's mainly it. And I would just invite people too, if they are curious more about what the things we talked about. I do have online courses. So there's an online course for Sola Mysterium. There's one for the Gospel of Thomas. Kind of, we were talking about it a minute ago. And hopefully in about a month, I will have a course for Sola Deus as well. And those are all, you can find all those. I would say if you just message me on social media, I can send you information. The URL of that is BK2SQ1, stands for Back to Square One, BK2SQ1.com. Or Choir Academy. Actually, that's easier. QUOIR Academy.com. Either one of those will take you there.
Wonderful. Keith, I'll have your links in the description so people can check those out. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me today.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you for watching the Love Covered Life podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and comment with your thoughts and opinions, and check the description box for the links to my free community where I share lots of resources, my Pay What You Can community where we do classes and challenges together, my TikTok, Instagram, my Clips channel, and lovecoveredlife.com where I share my paintings. Thank you so much for your support.